Helfand is a physician. He's a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. And ICAN was the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. He's also past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which actually founded ICAN. And that organization, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, received the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. Ira is also the co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, okay, which is the US affiliate of IPPNW, and he's a member of the steering committee of the Back from the Brink campaign. So as I said, we're family. In 2023, he received the Gandhi King Ikeda Award from the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College. So please help me welcome Dr. Ira Helfand.
Thank you, Anne. Good evening, everyone. I have a very soft voice. I will try to speak as loudly as I can, but if you're having trouble hearing me, please wave or something so that I know to try to speak louder. You know, this is a very extraordinary year for us to be gathering in to discuss the nuclear weapons issues for two reasons. First, it's the 80th anniversary of Trinity, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. But it's also the year in which 5 countries which have nuclear arsenals have been engaged in open hostility, sometimes with each other. A year in which we've almost had a nuclear war just 2 months ago. And so we really need to look at 2 separate issues, quite related, but somewhat distinct tonight. One, the past and ongoing harm that has already happened to the people here in New Mexico and others around the country. And Tina and Mariah will be talking about that a little bit later in the program. And secondly, the danger that we all face of a nuclear war today, which is what Eddie and I are going to be talking about. I assume all of you, for being here, are somewhat aware of the fact that we have not escaped the nuclear threat, as most of the country, most of the world, unfortunately, believes. You know, when the Cold War ended, we all acted as though this problem had gone away, and it has not, as we all know. There are thousands of nuclear warheads left in the world today, in the possession of 9 countries, and it is the assessment of experts that we are closer to nuclear war today than we have ever been, closer than at the worst moment of the Cold War. It's partly because of the situation between the United States and Russia, which has been made infinitely worse by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the stream of nuclear threats, explicit nuclear threats that have come out from the Kremlin since then. But it's also related to the relations between the United States and China, which border on open conflict, about the situation in Korea, about the situation in the Middle East, and about the situation in South Asia, where we literally almost had a nuclear war early in May of this year. 2 countries heavily armed with nuclear weapons that have fought 4 wars, fought a 2-day mini-war in which they bombed each other's missile sites and Air Force bases, including sites which housed nuclear weapons. That conflict could easily have escalated into the nightmare which we all dread. I think in this situation it's important to remind us, and that's what I want to do tonight, about what that means, what will happen if there is a nuclear war. Because even those of us who are aware that the danger has not gone away have, I think, done a pretty good job of denying to ourselves what that is going to mean, what a nuclear war would actually look like. And I want to start by describing what would happen to a large city in a nuclear attack today. Many of us have images in our mind. We've seen the pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they're very powerful warnings of what nuclear weapons can do. But what we really need to understand about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if there is a nuclear war today. If the United States and Russia go at it, it's not going to be one 15-kiloton bomb on one city. Most of the weapons in the US and Russian arsenal are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And most of the major cities in the United States and Russia are targeted not with one weapon, but with anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 or even 20 of these warheads. It is technically very difficult to describe to you 10 explosions, 15 explosions going off all at the same time. And so I'm going to use a model of one very large explosion, a 20 megaton bomb. We actually used to have weapons that big. We don't anymore. The megatonnage, the destructive force in this weapon is somewhat larger than that of the weapons that would be used against a big city. The destruction I will describe to you is actually a significant underestimate because you cause more damage if you use many smaller weapons. But it puts us in the right ballpark. It lets us know what we are dealing with. Within 1/1000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour, mechanical forces which can destroy anything that we can build. To a distance of 6 miles, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. And you would get hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, covering 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, or Moscow, or Beijing, we're talking about 12 to 15, possibly 18 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would happen at every major city in both countries. All told, perhaps 100, 200, maybe 300 million people dead in an afternoon. Those who survived would find themselves living in a wasteland that we cannot imagine. None of the things that we require would be there. There'd be no electricity, no internet, no cell phones, no public health system, no food distribution system. And in the months following, the vast majority of the people who did not die on day one would also succumb. They would die from radiation poisoning, from infectious disease, from starvation, from exposure to the elements. But this is just what happens in the countries that fight the war. This conflict would, however, be a disaster, a catastrophe for the entire planet, because all those fires would boost 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the planet an average of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, places like Albuquerque, the temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. And under those conditions, all of the ecosystems which evolved since the end of that ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and in the first 2 years, the resulting famine would kill 3/4 of the human race, 6 billion people. This comes from a study that was published in the summer of 2022. The study only went for 2 years. The famine would continue, and we don't know what the ultimate death toll would be. That same study also looked at what would happen if India and Pakistan had actually gone to full-scale war in May. And it showed that the death toll from a nuclear exchange between these two countries in South Asia could reach 100 million people in the first week. It also showed that enough soot would be put into the upper atmosphere to trigger a global famine. Not as severe as that caused by a war between the United States and Russia, but bad enough to kill in the first 2 years 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity, including 130 million people here in the United States. What I've just described is not the plot of a movie. This is the danger we allow ourselves to live with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. And we have to understand that if we do continue to allow them to exist, it is not a question of if, but only a question of when this will happen. We know of at least 6 occasions during the nuclear weapons era when either Moscow or Washington actually began the process of launching its nuclear arsenal, always in the mistaken belief that it was already under attack by the other side. On each of these occasions, we were not saved because we knew what we were doing. We were not saved because deterrence works, because our leaders are wise, because our technology is perfect. We were saved, in the words of former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, because, quote, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And the only thing that stands between us and the Holocaust that I described a few minutes ago is continued good luck. And that's what all the countries that have nuclear weapons are counting on. But that's crazy, because we all know that good luck doesn't last forever. And sooner or later, if we don't get rid of these weapons, our luck will run out, and they will get rid of us. Now, that's the bad news, and it is very bad. But there is important good news. This does not have to happen. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It is not as though an asteroid is coming at the planet and there's nothing we can do about it. These are little machines that we have built with our own hands. Most nuclear warheads are about the size of the chairs that you're sitting in. We've already dismantled more than 50,000 of them since the height of the Cold War. We know exactly how to dismantle the 12,000 that remain, and we can do it in 3 or 4 years if we make that decision. And that's where we come in, because we need to make that decision. We, the people, need to make that decision and make our leaders adopt it. When I talk about these things, I feel a certain responsibility, because by reminding you of the enormous danger we face and of the possibility that your actions can end that danger, I place a great responsibility on your shoulders. And it's a burden. It doesn't feel good to know that all of this responsibility is resting with you. But I think we should look at the current situation in a different way also. Every one of us wants to do something good with our life. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity, literally, to save the world. And there's nothing better that anyone can ever do with his or her life. Since we're in a synagogue this evening, I would like to close my remarks with a passage from the Hebrew Bible that I think sums up our situation. In Deuteronomy, it's reported that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, so that you and your children might live." That is the choice before all of humanity today. So let us choose wisely, and let us act with courage and determination, so that indeed our children might live. Now, one last thing I want to say. Despite what I've been talking about, I'm not a pessimistic person. I have great hope that we can succeed in this effort. And one of the things that gives me that hope is the response that I have seen among young people when they hear about this problem. There's a notion out there that young people aren't that active on the nuclear weapons issue, they don't care about it. That's not true. They don't know about it because we haven't taught them about it. But when young people do hear about this, they want to do something about it. And it's my great privilege and honor to introduce to you the next speaker, Eddie Lachey, who is just finishing his freshman year in college. Eddie heard about this issue a couple of years ago as a high school student and did the obvious thing. He started a national organization, Students for Nuclear Disarmament, which now has chapters on 14 campuses across the country. He organized in his own town, Burbank, California, for a resolution to be adopted by the mayor, and invited the mayor. He went to see the mayor, and the mayor said, "Can I come to your school and talk to you and your friends?" That's the kind of stuff he's gotten done. And he works with a group of equally talented and dedicated young people, high school and college students. And it's quite clear to me that they're going to take up the torch. We're not going to pass it to them. We're all going to have two torches now. The old folks like me and the young people together, each with our own torch, each getting this job done. So please join me in welcoming Eddie Lachey.
I want to ask you all a question. Who here, after hearing Dr. Helfand's speech, does not want to be bombed by a nuclear weapon? I felt the same way as many of you the first time I heard him share about the impacts of a nuclear weapon 2 years ago today. And so today I'd like to share with you guys how I got involved with nuclear disarmament as a result of hearing Dr. Helfand's speech. So to reiterate, my name is Eddie Lachey. I'm 19 years old, and I'm a second-year civil engineering student at California Polytechnic University in San Luis Obispo, California. And so 2 years ago, I met Dr. Helfand when he was giving a speech at a student conference that my Buddhist organization, Soka Gakkai International, was hosting. I vividly remember, as I heard him describe the effects of a nuclear attack, I thought to myself, how on earth could this even be possible? And how dare people even consider enacting this hell onto innocent people? I was terrified and also furious. I wanted this situation to not be true, but it was. From the depths of my being, I cried out in opposition to this potential future. I vowed, this must never happen. I will do the most I can to abolish nuclear weapons. And so, after his speech, I went up to him and I asked him, what can I do to make a difference? And he told me about the Back from the Brink campaign, and I'd like to describe it to you all today. So the Back from the Brink campaign is a grassroots coalition that is centered around bringing communities together to call on the U.S. to change its policies to bring the world back from the brink of nuclear war towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. He described to me that Back from the Brink is centered on this congressional resolution titled House Resolution number 317, which contains policy changes that the U.S. can enact, which experts believe reduce the threat of nuclear war, increase global security, and make significant progress towards international disarmament. The first policy change is for our country to engage in negotiations with the other nuclear-armed nations to collectively reduce their nuclear weapons arsenals. Second is to renounce the option of using nuclear weapons first, for the damage is devastating for all inhabitants on this planet. Third is to have a system of checks and balances that inhibit the president's sole authority over our country's nuclear weapons arsenal. In other words, making the use of nuclear weapons not a single person's decision. Fourth is to remove all U.S. nuclear weapons from hair trigger alert. So this is also known as launch on warning policy, and it's a tactic from the Cold War era that is still in place today. It allows over 400 of our land-based nuclear weapons to be launched within 5 minutes of our president's order when notified of an incoming nuclear attack. So one may ask, why would taking missiles off of hair trigger alert increase our security? Well, the Union of Concerned Scientists answers as follows. Doing so would remove the time pressure to launch these missiles very quickly in the event of a warning of an attack. It would eliminate the risk of launching missiles in response to a false warning. At a minimum, it would reduce the risk of accidental and unauthorized launches, end quote. And the fifth policy change is to cancel the U.S.'s current plan to put over $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years into enhancing and upgrading our current nuclear weapons arsenal. Not only is this such a waste of money, but it is done in the hopes of winning a nuclear war against another country. But the truth is, there is no winning a nuclear war because everyone suffers. So these policy changes can only be passed through the efforts of ordinary people. How this happens is through the democratic process of citizens urging their local city governments and representatives to agree with these policy changes. And for those cities and representatives to then call for these policy changes to be implemented on the national level. To get their cities to take a stand for nuclear disarmament, citizens can make a resolution that calls on the city to support these policy changes. This is what is known as a Back from the Brink resolution. Then they can collect signatures and meet with their city council members and get them to hold the resolution up for a vote. If it passes, then the whole city is now effectively calling on the United States to change their nuclear weapons policy in the same aforementioned 5 ways. So the more cities that do this, the more pressure it is on the federal government to do what they say. In the same vein, also, ordinary people can collectively urge the representatives to co-sponsor HRES 317, which would allow those representatives to put pressure on the federal government to make into law these 5 policy solutions. When enough politicians support Back from the Brink's nuclear disarmament policy, there will be no choice but to adopt these policy changes and move the world towards a safer place. But keep in mind that this is only possible with the united efforts of everyday people like us speaking out for peace. And by the way, we actually have the materials for you guys to be able to reach out to your representatives in the table back there. So feel free to do so later in this event. So after hearing about this campaign from IRA,
Just speak up a little more and slow down.
Okay, I got you. After hearing about this campaign from IRA, I was encouraged to get a Back from the Brink resolution passed in my hometown of Burbank, California. And so, during the fall of my senior year, I decided to start a nuclear abolition club in my high school. But I was unsure if anything could be accomplished, and I was super nervous about speaking in front of groups of people. But what gave me the strength to continue forward was my determination to abolish nuclear weapons, to rid the world of this evil, to protect my home, my country, and the people whom I share the world with. And so with this sense of mission in my heart, the club soon consisted of a determined group of individuals who worked to bring our community together to stand for nuclear abolition. We did so by informing our classmates about the threat of nuclear war, had guest speakers at the school, held booths on campus with educational posters, and met with our city council members and mayor. And to our surprise, just 3 months after the club started, the mayor, on behalf of the whole city, issued out a proclamation of support for the abolition of nuclear weapons. While this wasn't a Thank you. While this wasn't a Back from the Brink resolution, we were still very happy to accomplish this, especially so soon. And so this process of students learning together, raising awareness amongst their community, and affecting policy change in their municipalities is the essence of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, which is the organization I joined as a steering committee member shortly after my club in high school got this proclamation passed. And so in the hopes that any of you interested would like to join, the structure of S&D is a network of high school, college, and graduate students who advocate for nuclear disarmament in schools across the country. S&D chapters are 2 or more students that meet regularly and work towards their respective nuclear disarmament goals, similar to my club in high school. Within these chapters, students work together to raise awareness of this issue through educational initiatives, engaging with their classmates, and also affecting policy change in their respective cities. As long as the chapter's actions follow S&D's guidelines, they have full autonomy on how they decide to advocate for nuclear disarmament. As long as I already said that. But I want to explain some example activities that a lot of our chapters have been doing are educational posters, hosting guest speakers, having group discussions, protesting at nuclear weapons sites, making art, watching movies, or even reading books about nuclear weapons. Students also strive to get their municipalities to issue out proclamations or Back from the Brink resolutions, like how I mentioned earlier. Many chapters also go canvassing to collect signatures through this petition that endorses S&D's grassroots cause for nuclear disarmament. At my school's chapter at Cal Poly, this has been our favorite activity, for we have had over 200 enriching dialogues with our fellow students. So I actually have a bunch of copies of this petition with me if any of you would like to sign later today to show your support for a world free of nuclear weapons. And so, to support the students in their efforts, we offer bi-weekly coaching calls over Zoom for each chapter and assist them with generating ideas, planning their club meetings, and achieving their advocacy goals. Furthermore, all chapter leaders of the organization are welcome to join the monthly organizing meetings where we have discussions and practice debates about nuclear disarmament, as well as update and encourage each other in our efforts. So I say all this because through Students for Nuclear Disarmament, I have been able to meet so many smart and determined people from all over the country at different nuclear disarmament events. But the one event that I will never forget was the 2024 Interfaith Trinity Test Remembrance event that took place here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was the first time I had ever been to New Mexico, and by the end of the event, I developed such a love for this state and the people in it. I learned about this state's scarred history with nuclear weapons proliferation and how much it impacted the people living here. I truly believe that if the people of New Mexico can transform their tragic past, they can prevent an even more tragic future for all of humankind. So after last year's event, a determined wish for the victory of New Mexico burned brightly in my heart, and it is still strong today. That is why I'm speaking here in front of all of you. And so taking that experience with me, I thought to myself, what is there to gain in this suffering-filled road that only leads to the end of the world? I thought about what needs to change, and it came to me that the only way for our world to enact disarmament is for people to have a change of heart. When more and more people are of the common mind that going to war and stockpiling these nuclear weapons is utter madness, then I believe our world will become more peaceful. However, in order for us to get to this point, what urgently needs to be held is an indomitable respect for the dignity and sanctity of all life on this planet. This is the way towards peace, and disrespecting life's preciousness is the root source of all suffering that human beings cause on each other in this world. Everything stems from this: racism, violence, apathy, and of course, the possession and use of nuclear weapons. I urge all of us to strive to recognize these negative tendencies in our own lives and consistently, each day, do our best to overturn them. I also encourage us to reach out to our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our classmates, and share with something that we have learned today. Open your heart to them and ask for their thoughts about the threat of nuclear war. To guide us in our journey, I'd like to end my speech by sharing the words of the Buddhist philosopher and educator Daisaku Ikeda, whom I regard as my mentor in life, by sharing an excerpt from one of his annual peace proposals titled Building Global Solidarity Toward Nuclear Abolition, which he sent to the United Nations. He starts by imploring us to consider these questions. Are nuclear weapons really necessary? Why do we need to keep them? What justifies our own stockpiles of nuclear weapons when we make an issue out of other states' possession of them? Does humanity really have no choice but to live under the threat of nuclear weapons? And he continues, if we are to put the era of nuclear terror behind us, we must struggle against the real enemy. That enemy is not nuclear weapons per se, nor is it the states that possess or develop them. The real enemy that we must confront is the ways of thinking that justify nuclear weapons, the readiness to annihilate others when they are seen as a threat or as a hindrance to the realization of our objectives. Let us abandon the habit of studiously ignoring the menace posed to Earth by nuclear weapons, and instead demonstrate that a world without nuclear weapons can indeed be realized in our lifetimes. Raising one's voice or taking action is something that we all can do. All that is required are the natural feelings shared by people everywhere: the desire to live in peace, the wish to protect those we love, the determination to spare the world's children needless suffering. It is the passion of youth that spreads the flames of courage throughout society. This courage, transmitted from one person to the next, can melt the daunting walls of difficulty and open the horizon on a new era in human history, based on the proud determination to make the struggle for nuclear abolition the foundation for a world without war, and convinced that participation in this unprecedented undertaking is the greatest gift that we can offer the future. I call on good people everywhere to work toward the realization of a world finally free from the menace of nuclear weapons, end quote. Please, let us embody these words as we leave this hall today, as we walk through the streets and see the beautiful trees and buildings and people. Let us appreciate the life around us and vow to protect it from the ultimate death that is nuclear war, to preserve thousands of years of human history and to ensure thousands more into the vast future. Let us take a stand and protect our world. This concludes my speech today. Thank you all so much for allowing me to share my hand. Thank you.
So beautiful. Our next speaker is Dr. Mariah Gomez. She is from the village of El Rancho in the Pojoaque Valley in northern New Mexico, and she now also calls Los Lunas home. Currently, Dr. Gomez is an associate professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico, where she teaches courses related to Chicano studies, Chicanx studies, New Mexico, and environmental justice. Mariah is a board member of Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, and she previously served on the steering committee for the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, and she assisted with their health impact assessment. Mariah's book, Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, Colonialism and the Effects of the Nuclear Industrial Complex on Nuevo Mexicanos, was awarded a Southwest Book Award and an International Latino Book Award. Mariah is currently co-editing a book on U.S.-Mexico nuclear relations. Most importantly, Mariah is a wife, a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a lifelong resident of New Mexico. She is lucky to continue to live, work, play, and pray nearby to her ancestral homelands. And please help me welcome Dr. Mariah Gomez.
I love this darkness, actually, and thank you, Anne and Barb, for inviting me, and also to Esteban and Marcial. Esteban, you're so special to me. It's nice to be here. I realized we don't have slides, and I was like, oh, that's actually kind of nice, but what'll be missing are some maps images, so I might pause and just kind of describe what might have been on the screen. And today I'm talking about the fallout before Trinity, the Rala test in Los Alamos. In 1943, the US government, by way of the secret Manhattan Project, had acquired the entirety of Los Alamos, New Mexico, for the purposes of developing the world's first atomic weapons. These efforts displaced Nuevo Mexicano and Tewa and indigenous peoples, including some who were living on the plateau up until their removal in 1942 and 43. Nevertheless, various laboratory sites soon appeared across the plateau, including one site in Bio Canyon, a finger canyon on the Pajarito Plateau. Beginning on September 21, 1944, scientists began conducting tests for implosion-type nuclear weapons in Los Alamos at Bio Canyon. The radioactive lanthanum tests, nicknamed the Rala tests, occurred in Bio Canyon from September 1944 until March 1962, totaling 254 tests. The tests were radioactive in nature and were designed to test implosion designs for the new plutonium bomb that they were forced to quickly develop. The radioactive fallout from these tests was dispersed on the ground and carried by winds over varying miles for each of the 254 tests conducted during the Rala program. The nearest populated area was Santa Clara Pueblo, the nearest populated areas were Santa Clara Pueblo, San Ildefonso Pueblo, and the village of El Rancho. Recently, I have been investigating these dirty bombs exploded in northern New Mexico over an 18-year period to explain why rural communities and indigenous and Nuevo Mexicano populations were initially not considered surrounding communities and how they eventually became test populations to model fallout dispersion from atmospheric nuclear testing in the Pacific and at the Nevada Proving Ground. Until recently, these communities have never been referred to as downwinder communities, yet they were. But one of the characteristics of nuclear colonialism is to silence rural communities of color. Today, I will give an overview of the Rala explosions as the tests that occurred before, during, and after the Trinity test and the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan in 1945. In the early 1940s, scientists had been planning to make a plutonium bomb the same way as the uranium bomb, which was a gun-type device. But when Los Alamos scientists received their first shipment of plutonium produced by the reactor at the Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee, they realized it was too strong and the spontaneous fission rate made it impossible. Instead of abandoning their plans to make a plutonium bomb, including the millions of dollars that had been spent on producing plutonium, the military leader of the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, ordered the scientists to find another way and another use for the plutonium. This is how the implosion tests of Rala were conceived. On July 17, 1944, Manhattan Project Director Robert Oppenheimer stopped work on the plutonium gun assembly and made implosion the priority. Initial requirements for site selection for these new tests stated that, quote, a site for each shot must be selected which is far removed so that winds cannot carry the material in dangerous amounts, end quote. Originally, scientists planned to use the radioactive barium and radioactive lanthanum, but when they abandoned the radiobarium, the protections for the site selections were reduced. In March 1944, Bio Canyon was selected for implosion experiments. It was selected for its, quote, relative isolation from communities, end quote. Remember, this entire town existed in secrecy, so it needed to be in Los Alamos. In fact, it was 3 miles from the town of Los Alamos where settlers from the Manhattan Project were now living. San Ildefonso Pueblo was the closest community, 8 miles by air. Another Tewa-speaking indigenous community, Santa Clara Pueblo, was also less than 10 miles away, and next door to Santa Clara is Huachupangue, and next door to San Ildefonso is El Rancho, 2 Nuevo Mexicano, primarily Spanish-speaking communities in the 1940s. Española was 11 minutes away from Bio Canyon firing site. The experiments were set in high explosives ranging from 40 to 700 pounds. Strontium-90 and other radionuclides were also present. In other words, these were not small tests. When detonated, the materials inside the high explosives were released into the atmosphere in the form of aerosols and solid debris. Especially with the World War II era tests, this contamination was carried to nearby communities who were entirely unaware, as was the world, that these tests were occurring. Radiolanthanum 140 has a 40-hour half-life. As it decays, it releases traces of barium and strontium-90, known specifically to cause bone cancer. By the time the Trinity test occurred and the gadget was tested on July 16, 1945, 32 radioactive lanthanum tests had already been conducted in open air in Los Alamos with no real way to track for fallout. According to one report, data regarding fallout from the early tests were typically, quote, collected by a 2-person team in a pickup truck equipped with handheld battery-operated dose rate measuring equipment and a 2-way radio. Locations of measurements were identified by recording the vehicle odometer reading along with a radiation reading in millirentgens per hour and time. Readings were made from the passenger side window about 3 feet above the ground, end quote. These readings were limited to the town of Los Alamos and surrounding points. Never did this 2-person team or anyone else enter the nearby communities to record radiation levels. In fact, official reports declared the areas, quote, unpopulated. One report states that, quote, for the first 125 shots or so, dose rate measurements of ionizing radiation outside the confines of Bio Canyon appeared to have been made only when the cloud was expected to move toward the Los Alamos town site, to cross the main Los Alamos access road, or during several special attempts to gather specific fallout data to the north, end quote. In other words, 0 measurements were taken in our local communities. By 1948, new technology was being developed to track radiation fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing. Atmospheric nuclear testing had subsequently commenced in open air in the South Pacific, where nearby indigenous populations have been irreparably affected. The Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratory wanted to evaluate a technique that they had created, quote, as a way to track a radioactive cloud and measure the radioactive fallout from the cloud to the ground, end quote. A series of B-17 flights in Los Alamos were conducted in collaboration with RALA shots to evaluate mechanisms for tracking fallout. So there were 2 images, maps that I wanted to show here. When they started these tests, essentially they sent a B-17 off to follow the cloud. And in one particular test, actually 2 different tests, but there was one particular test where they tracked the cloud out all the way to Abiquiu, which is about 22 miles from the Bio Canyon, and from Abiquiu it went all the way to Huatros. So I know Sophia's in the room. We're looking Wagon Mound, Huatros area, Ocate, all the way near Las Vegas, New Mexico. I lost my place, sorry. In a May-June progress report, Dr. Thomas Shipman, commenting on the risk of fallout, says that, quote, general agreement has been reached, however, that in the future no shots will be fired in Bio Canyon if wind is in such a direction as to necessitate a roadblock, end quote. He is referring to the road that ascends the hill, and his comment indicated that the main concern was for cars passing through. Not until 1950 did they realize that the fallout was actually affecting communities off the hill. Although they were never mentioned or examined, local communities were in the direct path of the radioactive fallout from the RALA tests. One of the things that I'm really interested in that I'm working on right now, Dr. Thomas Shipman, I don't know if that name is familiar to any of you all. He started working during the Manhattan Project. He ended up later being a community member living in Nambe in the Poake Valley, And part of what I've been investigating, interviewing people, as well as archival research, is that one of my beliefs is that one of the reasons he started actually paying attention to the fallout in nearby communities is because he was raising his family there. Many people out there want to dismiss what happened 80 years ago with Rala, with Trinity, and with Japan for numerous reasons. Further, they refuse to make the connections between the Manhattan Project 80 years ago and the current efforts to expand nuclear weapons manufacturing. In May of this year, Secretary of Energy Chris Wright stood in front of Robert Oppenheimer's house in Los Alamos for a photo op and announced that we are in a, quote, new Manhattan Project. He was referring to artificial intelligence, but this was an effort to distract from the expanded plutonium pit production at Los Alamos. Also, AI is definitely a nuclear issue, and you don't have to look too far to see how the push to build small modular nuclear reactors in the US is part of the push for AI. Yet we still have no place to store nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste in this country. But Secretary Wright admitted to what many of us have been saying for almost 10 years, we are in a new Manhattan Project, and it's undeniable. The federal government is barely beginning to reckon with the impact of the actual Manhattan Project. When the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act reached its sunset date last summer in June 2024, it became a bit unclear as to how amendments to include New Mexican downwinders, uranium workers, and other populations would occur if the law had essentially ended. In a turn of events that we are barely beginning to unpack, RECA was reauthorized in Congress on July 3rd, 2025. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act included language that to reauthorize RECA while it simultaneously pumped millions of dollars into nuclear weapons expansion and development, as well as cut Medicaid and access to health care, among other terrible things. Section 100201 of the bill extends RECA until December 31st, and the language in the bill states 2028. Section 100202 includes New Mexico in the law for the first time ever as downwinders and changes the beginning and end dates of being in Section 100202 includes New Mexico in the law for the first time ever as downwinders and changes the beginning and end dates of being in the affected area to begin on September 24th, 1944, and the end date from October 31st, 1958 to November 6, 1962. There are other important changes to RECA under this reauthorization, but for the purposes of my focus today, I want to point out that those beginning and end dates coincide with the radioactive lanthanum tests that occurred in Los Alamos. Section 100203 relates to uranium workers, and Section 100204 relates to Manhattan Project waste. This is a bittersweet moment, and it does not signify the end of the fight to rectify the harms imposed on communities, especially indigenous communities and communities of color, by the federal government. So let me end with this. The National Nuclear Security Administration is currently accepting public comments on the Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement until Monday, July 14th, 2025. That's 2 days from now. While there are many concerns related to the environmental impact of expanded pit production here in New Mexico at Llano and in South Carolina at the Savannah River site, I want to put two things out there right now. 254 Rala tests and the 1945 Trinity test were conducted in New Mexico, and those aren't even the only nuclear tests that have been conducted here. But the government has only now, 80 years later, admitted to making people sick, even resulting in death, and has just included New Mexico in RECA for the first time as downwinders. What would be required for new nuclear weapons design? More uranium mining on indigenous homelands? That's already happening. Will testing resume? Where will testing occur? The United States already has 15,000 plutonium pits in storage, and those pits have a lifetime of approximately 100 years. The average age of the stored pits is approximately 42 years right now. Why do we need to start producing 80 new pits per year in the US, with 30 of those here in New Mexico? This also means that the waste isolation pilot plant in southern New Mexico is being eyed for expansion. We cannot let them buy us off and silence us because they included New Mexico downwinders in RECA. This is not the end, this is only the beginning. Y'all have 2 days to submit comments if you haven't already done so, and I invite everybody who's here to do that before Monday. Thank you.
All right, so our next speaker is Tina Cordova, who is a 7th generation native of New Mexico, born and raised in the small town of Tularosa in south central New Mexico. And in 2005, Tina co-founded the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium with the late Fred Tyler. The mission of the consortium is to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the unknowing, unwilling, uncompensated, innocent victims of the first nuclear blast on Earth that took place at the Trinity site in south central New Mexico. Ultimately, the goal has been the passage of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act amendments to bring much needed, health care coverage and partial restitution to the people of New Mexico who have sacrificed and suffered with the negative health effects of overexposure to radiation since 1945. Tina is a cancer survivor herself, having been diagnosed with thyroid cancer when she was 39 years old. Please help me welcome Tina Cordova. We are very lucky to have her.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Ann and to Judy and to Barb for putting this event together and for inviting me to be one of the speakers. And I want to thank Ira and Eddie and Mariah for never hesitating to tell the truth about this insidious industry that we live with in New Mexico all the time. An industry that has caused so much harm to us. An industry that's growing, not being minimized, and an industry that we all have to stand up to if we're going to see the change that we need to see. I have been working for 20 years to bring attention to the health effects we've suffered as downwinders and uranium workers in the state of New Mexico. And I'm very glad to say that this year, just a week ago, they finally, 80 years later, acknowledged by including us in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that's been taking care of downwinders from other places for 35 years and looking away from us. We knew, we always knew, we could not have done this work for this long without knowing deep inside of us that it would happen someday. And lately, as people said, don't you think we're worse off now than we were at the end of last year? I would say no. I don't think we're any better. I don't think we're any worse. I think we're in the same place. And I was saying constantly, the stars will align for us one day, and they will have to come back and acknowledge the harm they did to us. And that's where we're at today. We've received an acknowledgement. Have they gone far enough? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And let me explain why. The end of the qualifying end of the period for RECA is 1962. As if detonating an atomic bomb in your backyard is a static event. The bomb is detonated, it releases radioactive isotopes, and it ends right there. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. Dr. Michael Ketterer, a professor emeritus from Northern Arizona University, is taking soil samples, plant samples, water samples from throughout New Mexico. The highest levels of plutonium he's found any place in the world, including Rocky Flats, including Chernobyl, are in the canyons around Los Alamos that feeds the Rio Grande watershed, that brings water all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. When they detonate an atomic bomb, it is not a static event. It releases all these radioactive isotopes. Strontium, the one we absorb into our bones, has a half-life of 35 years. So 1962 cutoff, Not acceptable. We will never stop fighting for more time. They gave us a 2-year extension. 2 years will never work for us, folks. We're looking at records that are 80 years old. I had 2 great-grandfathers alive at the time of Trinity in Tularosa. 10 years later, they were told they had stomach cancer. We'll never know because we didn't have diagnostic equipment. No one had heard the word cancer in our community before. They were given morphine, they were sent home to die. They suffered, they both died. My family should qualify for compensation for those 2 men. But that won't happen. We'll never find death certificates that list stomach cancer for them. It will not be an easy process. For some people it might be very simple, but for others it won't be an easy process. So we will have to work very, very hard as a community, as a state, to make sure that we shore the program up and that we continue to fight for more time. The other thing too, they stripped out the health care coverage. I know because we have been collecting health surveys for 18 years, and we ask the question, how do you access health care when you get sick and you have cancer and you can no longer work? And what do you think the boxes that they check? Medicaid, Medicare. So if we have deep cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, and I've been saying this for a long time, folks, I guess people will just die in the streets around us. We cannot settle for them taking out the medical care because they say it's going to cost too much, because we know that they're going to spend trillions of dollars on modernizing our nuclear arsenal while we die in the streets, I guess. So we have to go back. It's a crack in the dam. It's an open door. And everybody keeps telling me once they open the door, it's easier to go through and ask for more. And we will absolutely do that. There are already people walking the streets in Laguna Pueblo telling the uranium miners, let us represent you, we'll file a claim. What they don't tell them is we'll also take a fee for that. And when the government writes the check to you, it's going to come to us. We'll deduct our fees and then eventually we'll get you a check. The Department of Justice is not even ready to take claims. Please share the information that I'm sharing tonight. We don't need out-of-state lawyers coming in and taking advantage of our people who have already been taken advantage of. We don't need that. We will set up a process for training people and sending them out all over New Mexico so that they can help people file claims. We're in the process of those discussions with our congressional delegation, with our governor, with our mayors, with state and federal agencies that will supply us with the documentation we need. And so we're all going to have to work together, and we're all going to have to be patient. There's enough money there. Kind of a funny story, folks. In the 35 years that RICA has been around, there was a period of time when it ran out of money, and the government issued IOUs to people. But guess what? Congress had to refund the program. Eventually, those IOUs were traded in for an actual check. So we just need to remember, the money's going to be there. And I've been reminding people constantly, this is not going to bring millions of dollars back to the people of New Mexico. It's going to bring hundreds of millions of dollars back to the people of New Mexico, who, by the way, in the newspaper today it said, and I've been quoting this and quoting this, in New Mexico we're carrying $881 million in medical debt. Imagine how many claims have to be filed to address just the medical debt we're covering in our state. We're one of the states with the highest level of medical debt in the whole country. $881 million. And I have told people over and over, a lot of it can be attributed to this. So in today's newspaper, there's this great story about how this national philanthropic fund goes out there and buys people's medical debt and then says, you don't owe it anymore. What a wonderful thing to do. And they've actually assumed medical debt for a large number of people in New Mexico this year and wiped away their medical debt. How beautiful. So that's the program, and that's what's happening. The uranium miners will get health care coverage, thank goodness. Thank goodness. They will get, and they will be able to apply for up to $400,000 in reparations, which is not a whole lot when you've been sick your whole life and you have nothing left and you've never been able to develop generational wealth to contribute to your family. So we're grateful for that. And downwinders will be able to apply for $100,000, one-time payment of reparations, and you will be able to apply on behalf of deceased loved ones. And the fund, and I want to make sure I stress this because people get this wrong all the time, they think that because they live in Albuquerque or Silver City or Roswell, that they weren't affected. But let me tell you something, folks. We worked with a Princeton scientist over the last 5 years. A group of ladies came to me and they said, can we take on a project that will assist you? And I said, hire a lobbyist. They said, well, we can't do that. And I said, okay, then can you find somebody using today's technology to map the Trinity blast? Using historical weather data and today's technology, map the Trinity blast, because what they tell us is the radiation went off in this orderly fashion over the most unpopulated parts of New Mexico, Claunch. And I always tell everybody, I don't have anything against Claunch, but I know that it didn't just go over Claunch. And they said no fallout went south of the test site, none. And so now a Princeton scientist has worked for 5 years on this. $40,000 computer, recreated the blast. The scientists at Princeton are behind him every step of the way. And what has he found? Trinity actually irradiated 46 states, Canada, and Mexico. And after he mapped out Trinity, he decided to map out the above-ground tests at Nevada. 93 detonated. 7 of them did not. 93 detonated. And what did he find then? He has found that New Mexico was the second most irradiated state during that process. We were the second most irradiated state during the testing at Nevada. And so it's high time that we're now included in the fund. In just a few short days, we will recognize the 80th anniversary of Trinity. And I want to share with you all just a few stories that people have shared with me through the years. There was Henry Herrera. He was 11 years old at the time, living in Tularosa. His dad had an old truck, one of the only men in Tularosa that had a truck. Every morning, Henry would go out with his dad before daylight to put water in the truck. He said, I would hold this makeshift funnel while my dad poured water in the truck because we didn't have antifreeze. So it had to be done every day in July. He said, I'm holding the funnel, my dad's pouring water into the truck, and all of a sudden we experienced this blast like nothing I've ever experienced before. The sky lit up brighter than day. Because, folks, that bomb created more heat, 10,000 times the heat of the sun, and more light than the sun. And Henry said that when the blast hit them, it knocked him off his feet. He fell to the ground. That day, Henry said, he watched that cloud, and he said it went in different directions, and then finally it came back over the top of Tularosa, and then ash fell for days. And when Henry was about 60 years old, he developed cancer of the parotid glands that spread to his jaw. And he had to have massive surgery, and eventually he had to have parts of his jaw removed, and he would have to come to Albuquerque and live here for extended periods of time and go into a hyperbaric chamber so that they could try to get enough oxygen to his jaw to save his jaw. He had to have teeth removed. He lived for a very long time, but eventually he died from that cancer. And there was my dad. My dad was a 4-year-old child living an incredibly organic life in Tularosa, drinking water from the cistern because, remember, we didn't have running water. The rain that fell from the sky in July, we collected it in a cistern, and they dipped water out of the cistern, and it was precious. It was only used for cooking and drinking, and sometimes the ladies say they would sneak a little bit so they could wash their hair. And my dad would dip water out of the cistern. He told me once that during the dry period of the year, His grandfather would lower him into the cistern so that he could dig the sludge out of there and then look for cracks in the plaster. That sludge was full of plutonium that fell from the sky that day. And my dad trudged around in it. And one day my dad developed a sore at the back of his mouth, and it was tongue cancer, and my dad had to go through incredible suffering to save his life. And then he got prostate cancer, and then 8 years after the first tongue cancer, he got another lesion at the forward part of his tongue that wasn't metastatic. It was another primary tumor. And when I asked the doctors, how could this happen? My dad doesn't smoke, rarely drinks alcohol, would never put chewing tobacco in his mouth, and has no viruses. How? And they said it doesn't, but we see it all the time here. My dad twice had to have parts of his tongue removed, had to have teeth removed, had to be on a feeding tube for extended periods of time. My dad used to drink massive quantities of fresh cow's milk. He ate all the things from the garden that my grandmother grew. They never knew they were poisoning themselves. The ash fell for days afterwards. It got on everything. It poisoned our landscape. It poisoned our land. They invaded our land and our lives, and they never came back. They didn't warn us before or afterwards. The last story I want to share with you is about my good friend Bernice Gutierrez. Bernice is part of our steering committee. She was born 8 days before the bomb in Carrizozo. 8 days before the bomb. She was a baby. She survived. We lost thousands of babies that summer. We have documented this. We have researched it. We have found the death certificates. Those babies, they had little bodies. Your exposure to radiation is a factor of your body mass. So the smaller you are, the higher the dose. And furthermore, women would have been concentrating the radiation in their mammary glands and breastfeeding their babies and not knowing that they were poisoning them. We went from losing 30 babies per 1,000 that summer to losing over 100 babies per 1,000. And our government has never looked back. And I always tell Bernice, you lived so that you could do the research, so that you could document every one of them, because we will not forget them. And we will not forgive our government for doing that to us. And the horrendous part of this story, if that weren't enough, is that when General Groves was finally convinced by the meteorologist who told him, we're going to spread radiation all over New Mexico, and the physicians that told him, we already know that exposure to radiation is dangerous to human health, he decided they would go ahead and set up an evacuation plan for Carrizozo. And they lined up cattle trucks when we have an active rail system going through town. We don't move cows in the summer, folks, because it's not humane. And I always tell Bernice, I picture your mom with an 8-day-old baby, wrapping her up in a blanket, being herded into a filthy cattle truck that doesn't have proper ventilation, no place to sit down, and being driven away from home on a dirt road, because our roads were dirt roads back then. To where? God only knows. They had no concern for what they did to us, and it wasn't until a week ago that they have ever acknowledged the sacrifice and the suffering of the people of New Mexico. And I have said over and over, I'll be damned if they're going to get away with this. And so here we are, folks. And I want to I see so many faces today in the crowd of people who have stood with me side by side, some of you at those protests at that Stallion Gate when they allow people to go in there freely as visitors and sell you a hamburger and a hot dog and tell you it's safe when it's not. All of you who have supported us, many of you have contributed to the TBDC in ways that we could never, ever fully acknowledge or give you enough thanks for. I want to let all of you know you're invited to join us. On the 80th anniversary of Trinity, the state of New Mexico will finally erect a sign at the Stallion Gate entrance to Trinity site that will recognize the sacrifice and the suffering of the people of New Mexico. Forever there's been a sign there that pays homage to the science and the scientists. But for the first time ever this year, the 80th anniversary, there will be a sign that says, people, there was a cost to this test in human lives, and we were that cost. And on the back side of that sign, there is the 150-mile radius map that shows that the area was not remote and uninhabited, that there were 13,000 children, women, and men living in a 50-mile radius. And if you extend that radius to 150 miles, there were 500,000 people, and it encompassed Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south, Silver City to the west, and all the way to Roswell to the east. It was our whole state. So we have the sign dedication at 11 o'clock. It's off of Highway 380. That's about 12 miles east of San Antonio. They're going to put up a big canopy, chairs, podium. Dignitaries will be there. Melissa Park, who is the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, will be there. It'll be a beautiful moment in time, finally a permanent acknowledgement that I always say to people these days, now that I know that it's there, that my great-great-grandchildren and yours will be able to stop there and know the history of what really happened. And then on the same day in Tularosa at 6 o'clock, we're going to have a mass at the Catholic Church. This was organized by Archbishop Wester. He invited the other two bishops to join him. So another historic event, having all three bishops from New Mexico in Tularosa for Mass. Mass is at 6 o'clock, immediately following dinner. We're going to feed everybody. And then about 8:30, we'll start our candlelight vigil. Our candlelight vigil, we have already constructed luminarias with the names of our deceased loved ones. And we set them up in the park. And we actually call out every name, because 16 years ago I said, if no one's ever going to recognize these folks, at least once a year their name is going to be repeated in our village so that they're never forgotten. So I invite all of you who are interested to be there with us. I know some of you are planning to be there, and I appreciate it very much. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina. Thank you.
Perhaps reminding us that our true nature is not destruction, it's love. In the cracks of empire, stir the seeds of sunflowers, breaking out from the depths to reach the sky. Bless the rains that nourish them, and the once forgotten hymn that holds the memory of how to read the signs. And I will be what I will be. I'll speak to you through the willow, and you will be just who you're meant to be, and love will be your name. In between our lonesome words, a golden winged flock of birds fans the breath of life alive anew. Here's a gift